Joe, would you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Again, welcome everybody. What we'd like to do before we get started, because Steve has to leave early. Steve, just want to do the quick talk about our Fredericksburg trip?
Yeah, just a word about, as you know, the Hershey and Harrisburg Civil War roundtables work together on our field trips, and we have 2 field trips coming up this fall. One was postponed from the spring. That's our Antietam trip. Currently, that trip is sold out. It's September 11th. It's a Saturday. However, if you're still interested in going on the trip, you can still register for the trip. Just contact Norm Daniels, the treasurer for the Harrisburg Roundtable. He's the one who takes all the reservations. He'll put your name on a waiting list. And it's been our experience that particularly when we fill up a bus this far in advance of the event, somebody's going to drop out for one reason or another. And almost everybody on our waiting list in the past has ultimately been able to go on the trip. So don't let the fact that it's sold out so quickly discourage you from going. The second trip of the fall is October 23rd, again, a Saturday. That'll be the Fredericksburg trip with Chris Mikowski, who was our guide at the Wilderness 2 years ago. And currently we have 22 seats filled on a bus that will hold up to 55. So there's still room on there. But again, I would encourage you to register quickly if you're interested in going, because these trips tend to fill up quickly, particularly after such a protracted period where we couldn't go anywhere. There's a lot of pent-up demand. Also, I wanted to put in a plug for the Harrisburg Roundtable's May engagement tomorrow evening. Ricky sent out the announcement to everybody who's on tonight earlier today. It's Alan Gelzo talking about his latest book on Robert E. Lee, which comes out in September. Should be a very interesting evening, and we hope you'll all tune in tomorrow night at 6:45. The link is in the newsletter that Ricky sent out. Thanks for putting that out earlier today, Ricky. We really appreciate it.
Oh, our pleasure.
See you tomorrow night. That's all.
Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to let Steve get going here. Steve, what I'm going to do, I'm going to mute everybody. Then I'm going to unmute you. Then you can go. Like I said, you give your talk, and then at the end, we open for questions, and also you have some stuff that you want to show us. And like I say, at the end, if you want to have a question, just go ahead, unmute yourself and ask the question, or you could send it through the chat, and I could ask him the question. So I've muted everybody. And then, okay, Steve, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? You can go.
Yep. Can you hear me, Ricky?
We're all good. I'm going to mute myself now. Good to go.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this. So thank you so much. Just a real quick background how this started. I've always loved history, and I've been a junkie on American Civil War for a long time. And I took a graduate history class. This was right around 9/11, and it was just kind of one of those things. I was working in New York and get my head out of some of the things going around me. And I was always fascinated by espionage and never really saw a whole lot on the Civil War. You hear all the stories about World War II and other recent wars and the things that went on. And I said, I'm going to dig into that. And at the time, there wasn't a whole lot available. A lot of the data wasn't digitized as it is today or generally available. And I started digging and found out some really interesting things. And that became a project on and off for a long time. But I was just fascinated, kept going back. And that's kind of a little bit of background on how this whole thing started. So Secret Army Behind Enemy Lines is a historical fiction. It's really about the war away from the battlefield. It's the backstory, the way I look at it, of espionage, deception, and disruption, which you think about with World War II and all the other ones happen here as well. And from the discussion, what I'm really going to try to do, because it is a historical fiction, I'm going to try to focus more on the historical nonfiction side of it, the research information that I found, because I really do think it's kind of a fascinating story, just looking at the real stuff. I really appreciate the people that are reading the book and like it, but that's what I'd kind of like to focus on and get into. And as Ricky, as you said in your note, I'm going to talk to the Richmond Underground, as they call themselves, or the Richmond Spy Ring. And I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with Elizabeth Van Lew. She was a Unionist spy. But what fascinated me is she was an unlikely spy, but also an unlikely leader of a spy ring. And most of the people that were in that spy ring were unlikely people too, which is probably great cover for a spy when you think about it. And they were from all walks of life too, because if you think back in that time period, the 19th century, people stayed in their swim lanes. You had different classes, people were very focused on that. And they even included slaves. Elizabeth Van Lew was actually part of the Underground Railroad prior to the Civil War. And she convinced her mother to free some of the slaves free all the slaves that worked for her when her father passed away. And then they became, relay workers to help move runaways through. So she had quite a background even before the Civil War and was kind of a wild card. Came from a family that was very upper class within Richmond society. They entertained people like Edgar Allan Poe, Chief Justice John Marshall, other celebrities of the day. But I think what really kind of hit home with her was when Virginia actually went into the Civil War. It happened right after Fort Sumter, when they decided to join with the Cotton South. I think she was shocked, and she wasn't alone. Almost 1/3 of the people in Virginia were against secession, and more than half of the people in Richmond were as well. So, it was in many ways, I think Richmond had more in common and Virginia had more in common with the North than it did with the South. It was an industrial base. The trade was booming with the North. You still had the tobacco, which is heavy industry, but it was more like the North, I would say, in so many ways. Although it was also the capital of slave trade at the time, and there were like over 500 slaves within it. What I'm going to do is kind of give you a little bit of the background of the whole spy ring, because I want to try to connect some dots and also kind of lay that out and also talk a little bit about on the other side too, because they kind of come together and it helps to build a composite view. So on the side of Elizabeth Van Lew, I think there were some things that happened that changed her perspective. Frankly, her mother, I think, really said to her, we have to be really careful. The Confederates don't want to hear anybody, talking negative about the Confederacy or supporting the Union. So we have to, kind of keep a low profile. So Elizabeth actually was helping to sew uniforms for the Confederates in the first year of the war with her mother. And I think that really traumatized her, because she came from a family where her maternal grandfather was mayor of Philadelphia, and it actually was a charter member of the Abolition Society of Philadelphia. Her mother had been strong abolitionist too, but they were so concerned about trying to keep the lid on that they just kind of acquiesced for the first year. Things started happening in 1862 that I think changed all that for Elizabeth. The first thing was really two very close friends were in prison for anti-secession views. That I think kind of threw her. And even though she destroyed most of her documents and asked for most of her documents back from Washington, there's still some information that we have. And she was very excited at the time about McClellan when he hit Pennsylvania. We all know the story, and he was marching up. She thought he'd move into Richmond and the war would be over. She, in fact, actually prepared a room for him to stay in when he got there. Of course, it didn't work out that way, and that was a devastating thing. And then there was a hanging of a spy, Timothy Webster, who was actually a Pinkerton guy. And just to say a couple words about Pinkerton, he did break a plot to assassinate Lincoln prior to his inauguration. He also got a lot of fame after the war. Bush Cassidy and Sundance Kid, he was one of those, who are those guys that chased him down? But as probably all of you know here, he helped play into McClellan's by talking, extending the size of the Confederate troops that he was facing, that played into his cautiousness and not wanting to engage. But also, he was convinced that the way to spy was through his detective agency. So he was putting his own people into Richmond and trying to maneuver that way. Webster was probably one of his best spies. And when he got sick and Pinkerton sent other spies to check up on him, that's when he was caught and executed. Elizabeth went to that and tried to comfort the widow. She tried to bring her back to her house. Confederates wouldn't let her. I think all those things for most people would make you say, geez, I better really be even more careful. But Elizabeth was the kind of exceptional person that decided to take things into her own hands. So the first thing that she did was she went, using her family contacts, she met with General Winder, who was the inspector general responsible for all prisons, responsible for training camps, and convinced him to let her visit prisons. He would only let her, he finally acquiesced, but only for the officer prisons. He didn't want a proper lady meeting with, regular enlisted guys. So she got into Libby Prison and started meeting with prisoners and started doing things like she had a hot plate with a false bottom, so she could exchange notes with them and bring it out. I think, originally they were just personal notes that were sent to families. Like she was helping Revere's grandson talk to his family and communicate. And probably there were notes too that provided information, because a lot of these prisoners could provide, information from the battlefield before they left. And potentially also she used slaves that worked for her that were now free to look at enemy position and strength and some of the work that was being done to fortify around Richmond. So I think it was kind of an anonymous level when she first started out. And one of her first recruits into the spy ring was a man named Erasmus Ross. He was the cousin of another one of their family friends who was in prison for anti-secession views. But the Confederates apparently didn't know that he also was the Unionist. So they brought him into the prison in an administrative role. And Erasmus Ross took on the personality or persona of a very tough hard-nosed that was doing roll calls, and all the prisoners hated him. But every once in a while, he would grab someone aside. He would argue with them, put him in solitary, walk him to his office. And he started providing them with Confederate uniforms to get out of the prison. Of course, a lot of those uniforms came from Elizabeth Van Lew, I assume, and her mother, who were sewing these. Also, Elizabeth Van Lew started bringing money from her own inheritance so that prisoners could bribe guards to get out of the prison. So that was kind of the first phase. But then she started recruiting, as I said, this unlikely cast of characters into the spy ring. And when I think about, as I mentioned before, people stayed in their swim lanes within Richmond. So I believe that she made these contacts, because most of them were working class, from John Minor Botts, who had been a Whig congressman and was a politician. And I'm assuming that most politicians like today, people from all different walks of life work together on campaigns. So Elizabeth either knew them, or John Botts, who was in prison and later, confined to his home, given her that list of names. Her second contact was a man named Sam Ruth, who was the superintendent of the Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad. And I'm speculate that may have had something to do with finding another path to get people, prisoners, and maybe runaways out of Richmond, with the Confederates starting to really kind of clamp down on security around the city. She recruited a clerk from the War Department. And the interesting thing about that, back in 1861, the New York Herald published this list that contained all the deposition of the Confederate soldiers in every state, the numbers, position, et cetera. And the Secretary of War at the time, I think his name was Roker, said if I had requested this kind of information, it couldn't have been more detailed and more accurate. And that, I think, flipped out Jefferson Davis, who was convinced that there were spies everywhere, right? Everywhere with the War Department. He had a tough relationship with Robert Keene, who was also a West Point graduate, who was the chief of the War Department under the Secretary of War. They stopped communicating with a lot of the generals because of some of these issues. And frankly, in a lot of the information I'm going to share with you, I think it had to come from a high source. The clerks of the War Department only had access to certain kinds of information. And if you look at any of the diaries of, I think it's A.B. Jones, who's the diary of a war clerk within the War Department, or even Robert Keene's diary, they talk about a lot of the issues in trying to deal with Jefferson Davis and the War Department constantly under attack about leaks. I think Jefferson Davis, frankly, was looking in a lot of the wrong places. Some of the other spies that she recruited were Mary Bowser. You probably heard about Mary Bowser. A lot of information's come out lately that I think makes it pretty clear that not only did she exist, but she was a spy in the Confederate War Department. Elizabeth Van Lew, she was actually born a slave into the Van Lew family, recognized that she was really an exceptional child. She was very smart. It's been said that she had a photographic memory. Elizabeth taught her to read and write, which was against the law in the South back then. But she also sent her to the same Quaker school she went to in Philadelphia. And I'm assuming she never expected to see her again. Mary Bowser went to Liberia for a while, but then came back to Richmond right when the Civil War was coming out. In 1863, April 1863, is when they believe she went into the Confederate White House. Elizabeth had developed a relationship with Verena Davis, and I think that one of her other recruits, who was the baker that was delivering food to the Confederate White House, was probably the key to alerting Elizabeth that they were looking for a maid in the White House. So that was about the time, if you remember, when Hooker was coming. I think someone was mentioning about Colonel Sharp, who had a very different attitude about spies than Pinkerton did. He wanted to tap into the Unionists in Richmond and really did end up doing a fine job of doing that in the long run. So that's kind of the way I look at it, the first phase of this, of the spying. It was pretty much anonymous. Elizabeth was surprised to find out things were already going on. As I mentioned, they all kind of took on different personas. So, Erasmus Ross played the tyrant within the prison. Sam Ruth played that he was incompetent. So even in the Peninsula campaign, he was derailing, having trains derailed or slowing down additional troops coming in for Lee, or supply trains to slow down. And because it was hard getting able people to run those jobs because they're all fighting or in the war, they maintained it. But Lee kept complaining about Sam Ruth being incompetent. Well, actually, he was a unionist trying to help from that perspective. So there's a whole interesting cast of characters that were part of this whole thing. But I think things really became interesting in what I call phase two. And that was related to Harry Katlin, who was a scout. And back then there was very little differentiation between scouts and spies. And so he was caught in Chickamauga, Battle of Chickamauga, and brought into Libby Prison. And Elizabeth at this time was told that she could no longer visit the prison. I think maybe they were suspicious of her. And by the way, there were newspapers, and some of the stuff I can show you later, 2 newspapers in Richmond that basically called out her and her mother without using their names. They said 2 women from Churchill are meeting with prisoners. What are they doing with these miscreants from the north? And really terrible things. She also would receive letters from the White Caps threatening to burn down her house, which was kind of a precursor to the Ku Klux Klan. But she was an exceptional person who just kept at it, never slowed down, continued to do these things. But Harry Katlin was in prison when a young girl named Josephine Hines was allowed on a special holiday, I think, to distribute little pouches of tobacco to some of the prisoners. And when he reached into his packet, there was a note that said, if you would be free, it was kind of incorrect English, get yourself to the hospital. So Harry, I'm guessing he probably ate all the tobacco and got sick. They brought him into the hospital. From there were people that helped him, helped get him out of Libby Prison, and he ended up going north. He worked for General Butler as one of his scouts. And Harry Katlin came back to Richmond and met with Elizabeth Van Lew, and said to her that Butler wanted to set up a special communication with her. I think Elizabeth wanted to remain anonymous. As I say, I think she was already sending notes, but at this point, he said to her, "Don't worry, I can show you a way to do it." And, you know, years ago when I first started this whole thing, I was doing paper. Went to Bridgeport Connecticut Library, and they had the memoirs of General Butler there. And I remember reading this note, and it was kind of a family note that said, "Dear Eliza, how's the family? How's Uncle so-and-so? How's my cousin?" And then there was an asterisk that said, in the written note, when lemon and heat was applied to this note, it said, "Can you tell us which roads are mined with torpedoes going into Richmond?" And as I was doing the research, I found the response to that, and I'll show those to you when a little bit later. But that's when they started communicating more formally. They used flag of truce boats because by now the Union had won the Battle of Norfolk, and they were using, you know, over the James River, sending these flags of truce boats with this information on Invisible that was going back and forth from Elizabeth to General Butler. General Butler, as you probably know too, was responsible for the whole contraband of war. So he had all these slaves leaving. He had said that even if there was a future slave act and all this stuff, that he was not returning slaves because they were contraband of war. And then it started all these camps, but there were, within like months, there were thousands of slaves that were part of this camp. And when he went to New Orleans, he was the first to actually develop and train an African-American regiment, which I thought was pretty interesting. But anyway, General Butler starts talking with her. You know, he gets slammed a lot for being a political appointee general, which he was, but he was also a lawyer. And what that contraband of war, I think, really played into the Emancipation Proclamation and moving forward in terms of helping the Union. If nothing else, you think about that they were using African Americans for non-battle jobs within the military, and little by little that was being depleted as well. So all those things kind of added up. But that was the second phase, and it was in that period that I think you can demonstrate most clearly that Mary Bowser had a huge impact. And the reason I say that is that there was another group that was kind of both one of the really notorious spy groups that was formed on the Confederate side. And that was a special secret act of Congress in February 1864. It was after Gettysburg and Vicksburg when I think the Confederates realized they could no longer win a conventional war against the North. So they funded $5 million for a secret espionage team to go up and create insurrection in the North and really kind of take it to a different level. And so when this happened, shortly after that, there was a Captain Tom Hines who rode with Morgan in Ohio and Missouri and some of the raids out there that had escaped from a Union prison, who came to meet with Jefferson Davis, with his Secretary of War Seddon, with Judah Benjamin as well, with this idea about taking all of these prisoners, former rebel prisoners that had escaped to Canada, and creating a team that could do raids to the North. They spent a lot of time talking about it. At the same time, they had allocated $5 million of gold to these espionage activities, 1 million of them to this team in Canada. They also were funding this group that had as head a guy named Richard McCullough, who, by the way, was married to Robert E. Lee's sister, who had been head of the chemistry department at Columbia, who resigned all of a sudden. Students had told the president of Columbia that they thought they saw him before the draft riots, because I come from a family of New York cops. I believe lots of times there's agitators to get these things going. And he was seen, putting up posters and others. And then he escaped, went to Richmond, and was part of this whole team that were trying to build chemical, basically Greek fire, napalm, bomb fires that you couldn't put out. And we're working on that whole aspect of it. So all these things are kind of going on. But almost immediately after these meetings took place, Seward, Secretary of War, William Seward, who was Secretary of State for President Lincoln, sent notes to his U.S. consul in Canada, in Toronto, and also Montreal, to be on the lookout for these people. And I also believe they may have gotten some of their code names because they were tailing, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, but Clement Vallandigham, who snuck back into the States, and they were trying to set him up to be the Democratic candidate, the anti-war candidate to go against Lincoln. Lincoln was afraid he wasn't going to ever be reelected again. The wars wasn't going so well at the time. But all of a sudden, they were starting to build out an information to kind of find where these people were. They were able to put in a double agent in Canada who started providing information, and I believe was tampering with some of their, plans to diffuse them. But what really I think was probably the most interesting part of this was what happened in New York, because they wanted to prevent Lincoln from being reelected, and New York was the perfect place to try, to go after and create insurrection. Fernando Wood, who was the mayor of New York in the early part of the war, wanted to secede with the southern states to continue cotton trade. The governor of New York at the time, his name was Horatio Seymour, was an anti-Lincoln person. And of course, a lot of the press in New York, as you probably know, was writing a lot of anti-Lincoln stuff as well. So the plan was eight of these operatives from Toronto were going to use this Greek fire and start fires on election day in major hotels in the New York area and try to create this insurrection. And they thought other people would rise up and they could create riots, and all this would help prevent Lincoln from being reelected. They went to officials in New York, and the officials all thought it was a hoax. Sounds familiar, right? So nobody paid much attention to it. And the day of the election, or actually a couple of days before the election, General Butler's army marches into New York City. He writes a note that's in the New York Times and says, "We're here to make sure that people's rights to vote are not tampered with. If you're law-abiding, you have nothing to worry about." And all of a sudden, the team gets a message from the Confederate leadership: stand down. So that's what actually happened on election day in New York. But they stayed around, and they decided to try it again on Evacuation Day, which was a big holiday back then in New York, where they celebrated the Brits leaving New York. And in this time, they were able to start these fires and then start in 13 hotels and other venues, including the old Winter Garden Theater. And police and fire responded to them. They took it serious. The officials, higher up, I think, still thought it was a hoax, but the first responders got there. But I still think that somebody tampered with those because they've been working on this for years. They thought they had something. Richard McCullough said, we have the right formula. This is what you have to do to build these Greek fire weapons. And none of them ever did any damage that they thought they would. And so I believe that that's pretty, I can't prove it, without a doubt, but I think there's pretty good proof there that here's Richard Butler directly communicating with the Richmond ring, shows up in New York and prevents this whole thing before election day. So those are some of the things that I found in doing the research that I went through. And there was the third phase too, and that was when Elizabeth Van Lew started talking directly to, or sending messages directly to U.S. Grant when he was in City Point. And the interesting thing about that, he was getting messages almost every day. They were sent by runners, or sometimes it was former slaves that were servants for Elizabeth Van Lew, sewed into their uniforms or in the soles of their shoes. But he was getting information on a pretty regular basis about enemy position. They were sending him the newspapers in Richmond too, so we could tell what's going on in the economy, all the issues that were going on. And so for all those reasons, I think that this spy team in Richmond had much more of an impact than people realize. And, I don't buy a word of this whole thing that, Americans have been rotten in the court for over 400 years. I mean, that's absolutely absurd. There are exceptional people, even in our darkest hours, that rise up. And when they team up with the right people that have the same kind of motivation, the same kind of ideals, you can do pretty amazing things. I mean, you think about the risks that these people took to try to help out, and they were doing it without pay. They were doing it without anyone asking them to do it because they believed in it. It was pretty extraordinary. So anyway, I know I've kind of rambled around. It's kind of late for me, but I'd be happy to try to answer any questions, and I'll show you some charts too, if it's all right as well. Did any of that make sense? I know it's kind of late. I'm probably a little bit.
Hey, Joe,
Everybody
go ahead and
sleeping?
mute yourself and ask the question.
You hear me?
Yeah, I
Okay.
can now.
Hey, Steve, well done. I mean, this is one of those little known areas that a lot of people just don't spend any time, but I'm fascinated with the Bureau of Military Intelligence, and for obvious reasons. Sounds like a lot of these people that were working with that group in Richmond were either sympathizers or people that had agendas against the South that they didn't necessarily have to leverage or coerce them or try other methods to turn them to their cause, that they volunteered to help with this.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I think that happened. And the thing too, and when you mention about how this is a story that's not told, that's because of them too. I mean, a good spy covers their tracks, right?
That's right.
And they were so worried about retribution. Elizabeth Van Lew burned most of her papers and asked the papers that were up in Washington to be sent to her, and she burned those as well. Mary Bowser did the same thing. She destroyed all of her documents, and her family later destroyed whatever else was left of it. So I think, but you're right. I mean, that they were so motivated to do this is pretty extraordinary when, there was not the kind of pressure, the things, the enticements that you'd usually think of in that role.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'd recommend, like I say, I was fortunate enough to get, because Amazon had Steve's book for free, but like I said, I'm about a third of the way through it, and Tim's about halfway through it. Even though it's historical fiction, it's got a lot of good information, and from the stuff that you're covering, that, like I say, a lot of stuff that you don't know that went on. Just like, remember, until recently, nobody knew that George Washington had a spy ring in New York City. They finally figured that one out. So yeah, this was excellent. So anybody have any questions? Then Steve, if you want, you can do. You know how to set up the share the screen to get the pictures up. Sure. Anybody else have any questions for right now for Steve?
I have one, and this is Norm, that I had heard that Elizabeth Van Lew did face retribution after the war. The people suspected that she had done this, and she was basically ostracized by the upper social class. Did you hear anything like that, or find anything like that?
Absolutely. She went through hell. I mean, even though, when Ulysses S. Grant first arrived in Richmond, he brushed by the city officials. They're lining up the street to shake his hand. And his first non-military meeting was with Elizabeth Van Lew. And when he became president, he made her postmaster, which was unusual, right, for at that time period for a woman to have that kind of role. But he was, and I've got one of the quotes in the presentation I have here too, but he said that you gave us the most valuable information that we received from Richmond. But her neighbors hated her. She had notes under her door, as I mentioned, while the war was still going on, that they were going to burn down her house. And the really sad thing, the Revere family paid for a gravestone because she used her whole inheritance helping prisoners escape and to help runaways escape. And after the war, the Revere family paid for her gravestone, and that was destroyed. Her house was taken down too. Her house was this huge, beautiful mansion, took up almost the whole city block, and now there's like a school there. So yeah, I think your point is well taken. She was pretty much ostracized within Richmond, even though she stayed there.
Yeah, I think just recently on C-SPAN, somebody had a book about her. I can't, for some reason, I can't remember, but it really curtailed right into the stuff that you were saying, Steve. But like I said, yeah, she really got in trouble near the end, because I'm surprised they never hung her or burned the house down with her in it.
Yeah, that's true. And by the way, a couple of good books, if you're interested, that helped me in the research, and I could send it to you in an email too. But Elizabeth Varon's book on the real Elizabeth Van Lew is fantastic. And that gets into, I use that pretty extensively in building a historical fiction. Also, I think it's David Ryan edited the notes. What happened is she burned diaries, she burned most of her notes, but she kept an occasional journal buried in her backyard. And they found that, and he edited that. And it's pretty interesting to hear her in her own words talking about some of this stuff. And then the other book I would recommend is Ashes of Glory, if you haven't read that before, by Ferguson. That's about what life was like in Richmond. You know, when I was writing the book, I was in New York 9/11. I wasn't anywhere near 9/11. I was in the Village area. But you know, when I talked about the smells and all this stuff, that came from what I remember 9/11. But you know, I can't imagine, because you know, Richmond was under siege, and you know, you had the blockade, you had all that stuff. The grayback, as they called it, was worth nothing. I mean, those people, you know, you hear about the siege of Vicksburg and what people went through. Richmond had it pretty tough too, as the capital of the Confederacy before it finally was taken back. So let me show you some of these pictures, if that's okay.
Was the Vermont St. Albans raid part of this Canadian effort?
I'm sorry?
The Vermont St. Albans raid.
Yes, that was part of it too, where they went in and they were looking for gold. You know, because you know, it was interesting is that the economy was collapsing in the Confederacy. So I didn't mention this part as well, but they were trying to break into a bank in St. Albans, I think, to try to get gold. They
Right.
also, or you know, U.S. dollars, I guess, and currency. But they also tried to sabotage ships in San Francisco and other areas where, you know, the gold was. Yeah, so that was one of the key aspects of it as well. Yeah. Let me pull this up. And we'll,
Steve, you mentioned Libby Prison several times during your presentation. Did your research uncover anything about prison conditions on Belle Isle?
Yes, yeah, which was even worse. I mean, Libby Prison was pretty bad. When they first opened it, it would have been an old tobacco facility, but it did have like running water. But they said that the maximum capacity was 1,000 prisoners. They had 700 when they first opened it, 500 from other places where they consolidated into Libby, 200 from the Peninsula Campaign and other battles that were in there. But the other prisons for the enlisted men were even worse. The Belle Isle, they were out in the open there, you know, so they had to deal with all the conditions of, you know, without any, you know, terrible stuff.
The reason I asked is my great grandfather was taken prisoner after Second Winchester and wound up spending part of his captivity on Belle Isle. Fortunately for him, it was still at a point in the war when they were paroling prisoners. They put a stop to that in the final year or two of the war, but
yeah, and a lot of the newspapers up north were talking about how terrible conditions were there, and then they found out that they were going to move them to Andersonville. You know, a lot of the prisoners, and that was what started the Dogger and Kilpatrick raid. You know, to try to free those prisoners. But yeah, I mean, the conditions were even horrible in Richmond too for any of the soldiers, Union soldiers that were there. They were treated pretty badly. Let's see if I can. I don't know why it's not. I don't
just
know
need
if
to go to
it's-
slideshow up on the top
Yeah,
toolbar there.
yeah. This is a little
There.
different than the last one. I don't see the slideshow. Maybe if I do it from. Okay. Here we
If
go.
you look, yeah, it should be down at the bottom. Down at the bottom, you see
Okay.
looks like a little screen.
Yeah, I've got the videos kind of in the way here. Let's
Yeah.
let me put. Hold on. Let me do this. Let me come out.
Steve, there's another way to do it. You can click on slideshow up at the top toolbar, and that should put you in slideshow mode.
Okay, look like it just froze on us.
Yeah, I don't see a slideshow up here though. maybe I have an old version or something. Let me see here. So, oh, shoot.
Well, we can all see a toolbar that starts with home over on the left, then insert, design, transitions, animations, then slideshow. As you read from left to right across the top, but can you not see that?
I see mute, stop video
Get all their
participants.
power
mute
from
share.
those unreliable hydro plants.
Yeah, let me, hold on. I don't know what's wrong with, I've never had this problem before, but for some reason it's not.
The cable's having trouble going through the Atlantic.
Is that better?
There you
There we
go.
go. That's good.
Okay. All right, just some of these pictures aren't really that exciting, but what I wanted to do is show you that this was a document from, I don't expect you to read this. I'm going to show you some of the key pieces of it, but this was about her estate, and this was from the wife of the executor for her estate. This is what was said, and I found this when I was doing some of the research, but pretty amazing. Openly loyal to the Union, talks about Underground Railroad, talks about she was, became post office department head for Grant. This is a view from Church Hill. Her house was positioned perfectly where she could see everything going on in
Wow.
both in the James
Wow.
River and downtown area of Richmond. This is her mansion that I said it was destroyed after the, I think after she died. I'm not sure how long after, but she was kind of a pariah within the community after the war. These were the notes when she started going into the prison that were in the local newspapers. I mean, it's pretty amazing. They don't mention her by name, but they talk about these women and their opulent means and comforting miscreants and Yankee offshoots. And this was part of the reason that they ended up taking her. I think there was a lot of pressure to get her out of the prisons, but pretty amazing that she just kept pushing forward with all this. And these were actual notes that they found in her her documents that were slipped under her door during the Civil War, and the White Caps were a precursor to Ku Klux Klan. And sorry for my little drawing there, but there was a crossbones.
Very interesting. I just find that's very interesting. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is what I was mentioning before when I was doing the research, and I saw, can you tell us which roads are mined with torpedoes going into Richmond? And I was able to get Butler's notes online, his memoirs and letters, and then I found the answer. All roads are mined into Richmond. And then Quaker was the contact within the War Department. He was clerk level, but this is the kind of information that General Butler was seeing. And by the way, what they're saying here, this is right before the Dahlgren raid when they were going in to try to save the prisoners before they went to Andersonville. And they specifically said, don't try to do it without 30,000. And I think they went in with 5,000 people. And of course it was a disaster. Nobody really knows that this is the real Mary Bowser. Another good thing about spies is they have different identities. She used a lot of different names. She was Ellen Bond. She was Mary Richards. She married someone named Bowser. She came back to Virginia after being in Liberia, and she was arrested for Negro without papers, which was kind of one of the laws, I guess. And she gave a different name there. So a lot of that started this whole thing that she never really existed. And of course, Davis would argue that she didn't exist. When I was in Virginia, I toured the Confederate White House, and I remember them taking the tour saying, the servants, they acted like they were furniture. They would do these, meetings, with the high level people, or he would play cribbage with Judah Benjamin, and they'd be talking about stuff as if, we weren't even there. So I thought that was kind of a, interesting perspective. They were looking for spies everywhere except in their own house. And this is the Confederate White House, picture of that. General Butler, it was interesting too. He was the Democrat who was pro-slavery, but did the contraband war. started the 1st Regiment when he was in New Orleans. And it was his unit out of the contraband camp in Virginia that was the 1st regiment into Richmond at the end of the war. And he became a radical Republican and was part of the team that was trying to impeach Andrew Johnson. This was in the New York Times the day before the election in 1864 from General Butler. The Army of the United States are ministers of good and not of evil. They are safeguards of constitutional liberty, which is freedom to do right, not wrong. They can be a terror to evildoers only. And it goes on from there. But this is when this was published, the Confederate leadership said, stand down. And Sharp, I love this picture because he was a man on the left, Colonel Sharp, George Sharp, who did all these innovative things, the signal corps and balloons to scout out the enemy. But he looks almost more like a Texas Ranger than a lawyer from the Northeast, And the guys around him are Secret Service too, I believe. This is a quote from Ulysses S. Grant about Elizabeth Van Lew, and also from Colonel Sharp. So for a long time, she represented all that was left of power in the U.S. government. In the city of Richmond, they sent emissaries to our line. When no one else could, for the moment, be found, they sent their own servants. They employed counsel for Union people on trial. They had clerks in the rebel war and Navy departments in their confidence. Soon after our arrival at City Point, Miss Van Lew mastered a system of correspondence and cipher by which specific information asked by the general was obtained. I mean, that's pretty wild, isn't it? Famous picture of the rear guard. When I lived in the South too, and this I found interesting, was I heard about the Civil War in a whole different lens, the war in Northern aggression. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues, and he was saying, oh yeah, it was the Union that burned Richmond, just like they burned Atlanta, and that kind of intrigued me too, to hear that whole different perspective on things. I don't know if it's still like that now. I know a lot's changed since then, but I found that kind of interesting. And that was Richmond, obviously, after the war. And this was a quote I actually put in the book from John Keegan, the British historian, but I thought it was appropriate. And that's pretty much it. So, I'd be happy to send this to you guys, or I could send it to Jim. But it's a 40 meg file. But if anybody's interested in it, I'd be happy to send it to you.
Yeah,
I am.
yeah,
I like it.
Why don't you send it to me, then I'll pass it on to everybody.
Okay, sounds good, Rick.
That's got a lot of good information there.
Well, I can't thank you guys enough. It's been a real pleasure, and you gave me a great opportunity here, so thank you. And I hope when I get back to the States, maybe I can come visit your club after COVID
absolutely.
and all that stuff.
Definitely.
Hey, Steve, go to the top and show your book that you're talking about.
Right here.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm a third way through. T's about halfway through. Excellent book. It's got a lot. Like I say, even though it's a fictitious history, it's got a lot of good information in there. So you really learn a lot about what went on in Richmond and what I'll call it the underground, what they went through for both getting the Union people out and also working on the slave underground. And like I say, how they sort of ignored the slaves. They know what they were doing, and they were just passing the information on freely to the North. They got a lot of good information out of them.
Absolutely.
Hey, Steve, Jim here. I just got your email. I was running late today. Had contracted in the household. Had contracted.
Jim, I'm glad you're here because I wanted to tell you there's a chapter in my book for you.
Is there?
We were talking last time the other day, and my dad was a New York City police detective, and Jim was with the police department in Stamford, and there's a chapter about New York's finest and what they did and to prevent insurrection during the 1864 election with Lincoln. So you got to check out that chapter.
I put a link to that on the book, is on the Facebook, on our website.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. Thanks.
Yeah. I don't know if I could get it to you. Yeah. Very good, Reed. Very good.
All right, guys. Well, stay well, stay safe, and thanks so much for the support. I really appreciate it. Look forward to meeting you in person one day.
Thanks,
great job,
Steve.
Sue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great. It was great.
Okay. See everybody. Good night. I'm going to sleep, Steve.
Thanks.
Bonne nuit.
Bye.
I'll be all wound up.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay. Okay, we'll shut down and see you guys. Thanks a lot. So hope to see most of
Thanks,
you guys
Ricky.
tomorrow night.
Good job.
Okay, great. See you guys.
Night,
Night.
everybody. See you tomorrow night.
Yep.